Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and Patrick Farrell, as always. Paddy, how are you this week?
I'm positively fantastic, Gary. It is a relatively foggy day here in London. Woke up this morning, Saturday for those people wondering. Woke up and it was fucking, like I have a balcony, couldn't see out my balcony at all. Like you've been on it. The balcony is maybe 2 foot, and past that 2 foot, couldn't see anything. So it was quite strange, but it's kind of clearing up now today. But anyway, look, you're not here to listen to my life. You're here to listen to Gary's life. Gary, how's life for you at the moment?
It's very good. I'm at home in Kerry, County Kerry, beautiful Killarney, on psychiatry placement. So I have 4 weeks of psychiatry placement, some community, some inpatient in the hospital. I am interested in psychiatry. I like all kind of neuro, brain, mind stuff. So I'm trying to convince myself to be a psychiatrist because it would allow me much better work-life balance than if I tried to do anything surgical related. And yeah, so that's my current mission, to convince myself to be a psychiatrist, and that would be way better for me and triage than if I was a surgeon. So
Yeah, well, surgery is the Chad. Fucking, just go in, cut people up, done.
yeah, 80 hours a week, smoking cigarettes, no food, unreal.
Barely any bedside manner as well. Fantastic.
Oh, just cursing, spitting. Yeah, pure butcher boy.
Sweating away, cutting other people, doing those triple fatality surgeries. You cut yourself, you kill the patient, and then you fucking cut your assistant's hand, kill everyone,
Unbelievable.
Leave tools in the person, everything. Your watch, oh fuck, where's my watch gone? It's in the patient you were just cutting up.
And yeah, go.
Yeah. Anyway, look, that's beside the point. Today, we're talking about foundational health management, right? That sounds a little bit weird, but effectively, you want to cover some of the foundational practices that you can engage in as an individual that will hopefully mitigate disease, illness, injury, potentially, all that kind of stuff that we would, consider ill health, right? Now, as we say with all of these podcasts, look, I'm an idiot. Gary's a trainee doctor, so take what we're talking about with a grain of salt, right? We're not experts. I like this stuff. Gary, you're interested in this stuff as well, so we're talking about it, right? It's obviously something that's very relevant to the populations that we talk to, because this is effectively the realm that coaching falls into. All of the stuff we're doing now potentially helps the individual longer term, right? Like if I'm advising someone to eat a load of saturated fat to get their calories up, that's potentially not setting them up for good health down the line, right? So what we talk to people about now, can potentially set them up for good health down the line. But what are the things that we should be focusing on? Where should our attention be when we're talking about this stuff? Now, some of the stuff falls in the realm of the kind of stuff that we talk about with our clients. Some of the stuff is just good practices in general, but you'll see as we go through this, there is actually a lot, and there's a lot more than just, oh, your diet, your training, like there's a lot more to this that you can be like, oh, that's actually a foundational health practice because it actually helps X, Y, and Z. And a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think of that as a health practice. And you'll kind of see what I mean as we get through the episode, right? Do you have anything to say, Gary, to introduce this topic?
No, let's get stuck in.
Let's get stuck in, right? Now, the first thing we have to consider when we're talking about this is, like, why are we looking at this at an individual level, right? Because a lot of these questions, they're societal problems, okay? And we have kind of two lenses in the society that we work in to talk about this stuff. We have what the individual does, and then what we'll call it the government or organization's mandate, right? And that can be through either not mandating some things or not taxing some things, or it can be through what they actually do and then what they also don't do or don't look after, right? So we can look at it from those two perspectives, the societal, like top down level, if you will, or we can look at it from the individual. Now, in the realm that we fall into and the general health and fitness world falls into, we generally tend to focus on the individual, right? Because I don't know about you, Gary, but I don't really have the potential other than my vote to influence how the government works, right? And like we can idealize or look towards something and be like, oh, we would like society to look like X, Y, or Z, but ultimately I'm not influencing society directly right now. However, to whatever extent I can, I can influence myself. I can do certain things that help myself, right? So when you're going through this episode, realize that some of these things, like, they are obviously influenced by the society that you find yourself in, the socioeconomic status that you find yourself in, all of those other things. But that doesn't stop the fact that you still have to look at this as an individual, right? Like, you can't just blame society if you haven't maximized yourself as an individual right now. You haven't maximized the things that you can actually be doing. Like, yeah, for sure, for certain populations, for certain people, some of these things are going to be a hell of a lot more difficult. And we've talked about that previously in terms of, say, the food environment. Like, if I'm saying, oh yeah, eat healthy, and you live in a food swamp or a food desert, that's going to be a lot harder, right? But there are still changes that you can make to align your diet into a more healthful or health promoting diet, right? And until you do that, you can't really be like, oh, well, the reason I'm failing at this is because there's too many McDonald's around, right? Like, that's definitely contributing to making it harder for you, but there are still things that you can do, right? Now, is that the whole answer to the question? Fuck no, right? But it's the answer to the question that we can focus on, okay? Do you have anything to say on that, Gary?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like obviously the higher level environmental, governmental, etc. influences have a very potent role on health, and I think that it's something that you have to acknowledge and that needs to be acknowledged at that level. But at the same time, as an individual, you have to ask yourself, what can I actually control? And you can see sometimes when people begin these discussions about higher level upstream influences on health, that they almost strip people of agency. And an easy example of that is that, telling people that they shouldn't worry about their weight or losing weight because it's primarily the result of the food environment and food policy, the food industry, etc. And while there's a grain of truth in that, or a lot of truth in that, and that the primary determinants over the last 50 years in increasing obesity is the change in the food environment, it doesn't mean that the individual does not have any power to change how they eat. And very often, the way that people use language when discussing that topic, they actually do sort of strip people of agency. Because if you tell people that they are the way they are because of higher order influences and that they're the most important things, and you don't tell them what they can do, then you sort of feel a little bit helpless. And that's clearly not what we would want on this podcast. If you're listening to this podcast, you're hopefully someone who's trying to take charge of your health, to make steps in the right direction. So even though there may be influences that are beyond your control, you should still try to bring as much as you can within the realm of your control and do your best to deal with it. Okay. On the other hand, it can still be harmful to think that you can control everything. So there does come a point where that perspective of recognizing the higher order influences, the upstream influences, are incredibly important. An example of that would be during the pandemic, for example. A lot of people, even if you don't even consider respiratory viruses, you just consider the impact of lockdowns and things like that. A lot of people found their mental health suffering. They might have had maybe low level of social anxiety when reintegrating into society again, when they were going out in groups, etc. And that is clearly the majority of the determinant of that is due to government policy or action related to the virus. Okay, it's not necessarily something that you was a personal failure or anything. So if you were to say that, oh, this is all my fault, and get into that cycle of kind of self-criticism and over responsibility for things that aren't within your control, that could potentially make that situation worse. So on each individual health determinant, you have to ask yourself how much of it is within your control and how much of it can you bring into your control. Because it might be the case that at the moment that you feel like something's beyond your control. For example, if a supermarket doesn't stock a particular food, but could you control that situation by going to a different supermarket, for example? And the answer to that might be yes, or it might be beyond your budget. So ask yourself, what is within your control? What could you bring within your control? And other than, as you say, using your vote and discussing with others, don't get too upset about the higher level things if they're not in your favor at this point in time.
Yeah, like I think the whole pandemic was a good exercise in showing people how much is within their control versus how much is government policy, government whatever you want to call the stuff that government do, what they're actually doing to influence society. Like I think in America, the average weight gain for a millennial, so they're this kind of like 30 fucking whatever age, 25 to 35, something like that. I don't know the millennial category. Was like 50 pounds. That was the average weight gain. 50 pounds is like 25 kilos. You know, and like that's, you know, whatever you can say, oh fucking that's a lot of weight to gain, but that was pretty much in response to what the government had done. Right now, obviously there's a virus going around as well that influenced people's behaviors. They didn't get out to exercise, blah blah blah. You know, there are other things that are feeding into that, but it is a good experiment to show like, okay, what the government does can influence what people do. And it sounds so straightforward, but you know, here was an experiment that showed it all, right? Anyway, look, we're not going to get too deep into the weeds with that. I just want to start this episode by saying that some things are in your control, some things aren't. Some things are still in your control, but due to the things that aren't in your control, it makes the things that are in your control a lot harder. You know, like we always talk, you know, privately, and we've talked about it on the podcast about the topic of like free will. Like, do you actually have free will? And I think both myself and Gary would consider people to have free will. I think free will is a thing. I think it is environmentally constrained though. You know, like I think your environment has a lot more impact on your free will or the ability for you to enact or exhibit your free will than a lot of people would actually like to say that it does. You know, like you can say that you're a bastion of health and you're like, this is, you know, I'm a really like healthy individual, but it might not be the case in a different environment. For example, I'll give myself as the example. I love training. I actually just really enjoy training. I really enjoy the process of resistance training, right? But the reason I enjoy the process of resistance training is because I can see that progression, right? So I'm like, oh, next week I'm going to add a little bit more weight here, or I'm going to add a rep here, or whatever. But if you take away that progression model for me, I actually don't really like training all that much, right? If I'm not seeing the stepwise incremental improvements, I'm like, yeah, it's enjoyable or whatever in the moment. And obviously certain things are more enjoyable, like jujitsu is more enjoyable, but I don't think I would enjoy jujitsu as much if I wasn't seeing myself progress, right? And that was something that was changed for me during the pandemic, where I'm like, okay, I've actually got an X amount of weights to use. I'm maxed out on that. I'm not seeing these weekly or monthly progressions. And while, yeah, we can bring in different progression models, there comes a point where I've tapped out on that exercise. So exercise for me became less enjoyable, right? So again, the environment constrained my ability to exhibit my free will, in this case, my ability to train and actually want to train. So obviously it works in other ways, right? Before we get stuck into this, Gary, do you have anything final to say to introduce the topic?
No, that's all good.
Fantastic. Right. Now, foundational health topic or foundational health habits or whatever you want to call these things that we're going to discuss. Most people are aware of, you know, the general healthy habit stuff, right? You know, we've talked about it before. It's the stuff that we talk about all the time. You know, you've got your basic fundamental stuff. You got your diet, your training, your sleep, and your stress management, right? And that's the stuff that most people would consider be like, okay, well, if you get those four kind of pillars sorted, you're in a good position, right? And we're going to dive a little bit deeper into each of those. But before we do, I want to also layer on top of that, even though you think that's all you're doing in terms of a, you know, foundational health practice, there are also other foundational health practices that are often discussed as a tangent to those other, you know, those baseline health habits, but it's kind of almost assumed that you're looking after these other things as well, which we're not going to just assume that you're looking after this stuff, because unless we actually talk about it, you don't know what we're talking about, right? And what I am talking about here is the kind of psychosocial aspects of health, and then also the spiritual, right? And again, you might be looking at spiritual from the context of organized religion or religiosity or whatever, but there's more to spiritual than just organized religion, right? And even into like questions like what happens to you after you die, like what are your beliefs around that? You know, are they beneficial beliefs for your health? Like, do they cause you to, you know, do stuff that is actually aligned with healthful practices, or do you become completely nihilistic and go, it doesn't fucking matter what I do anyway, I'm going to die and I'm just going to go to atoms and Who cares, right? So we have to look at those things because, again, it does actually influence our health, right? So before we get into that, I actually want to bring it back and talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or Maslow's motivational model, right? And the reason I want to talk about this, and most people have seen it, and like it's not like I don't think it's the be all and end all of a model that teaches you how to work in the world or navigate the world, but it does lay some sort of foundational thinking for how you should potentially think about your health management, right? And if you've seen Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's a pyramid, right? At the base of that pyramid, we've got physiological needs, right? And that's kind of covered by the stuff that we're talking about when we're talking about health, when we're talking about diet, training, sleep, all those kind of things. A lot of those fall into the realms of like physiological needs. Now, some of the physiological needs, they are much more deep than that, like oxygen, like you need air, like it's a physiological need. Like as a human, you need air, right? And again, you'll see this if you ever fucking have nearly drowned, you'll see how ingrained that motivation and that hierarchy of needs, how much of a baseline need that is, because everything else shuts down for your body. No, you're not thinking, you're completely present, you're in the moment when you're drowning, because all that matters to you as an organism is get the fuck out of the water, right? Get some air into your lungs, right? So there are obviously more important needs than others. And this again starts this thought process of there's clearly a hierarchy of needs here. Some of them are really foundational, and some of them are, still foundational, but less important, right? And there are also other things in this pyramid. There's safety needs, right? And again, I think most people would be aware of what these are in terms of, you want to live in an environment where you're not getting shot at, you're not, in Afghanistan or anything like that. Like you need to be safe, your house is not getting bombed, et cetera, right? But there's also, again, gradations within that, because you could live in a, say for example, a Western world, but you don't feel like you're in a safe environment. There's a lot of robbery or violent crime in your area, right? Or potentially the people that you hang around with are just not good people, or I don't know, you're in an abusive relationship or whatever, like you don't feel safe. So again, gradations within that. The next thing that's on that hierarchy of needs, or that motivational model, is your needs for belonging and love, right? And again, this is often stuff that we just go, oh yeah, like we assume that's looked after, right? But oftentimes it's not. And it's really apparent, again, because I live in London, talk to different people. Like a lot of people will be, working from home, for example, and they basically don't talk to anyone else apart from their work colleagues all day, right? And maybe they go to the gym, and they're in a position where they don't really feel a sense of belonging, right? And they don't really feel love because they're on their own. Yeah, all they do is work. Maybe they fucking play PlayStation in the evening or whatever, but they're not integrated into their society. They don't feel that sense of belonging. They don't feel that sense of love. Like we've kind of talked about this before, but generally speaking, two is the fundamental unit of humans, right? Like a single human on their own doesn't really work all that well, right? Like, yeah, we can survive on our own, but it seems to be that you need at least two humans to actually feel like a complete human, right? Now, the Greeks had an idea about this where, the gods basically had split our soul in two, and, you were kind of destined to wander the earth until you found your counterpart, the other half of your soul, right? That's effectively where in the West we got that idea of soulmates from, where it's like it comes from that Greek mythology. And again, that's probably influenced by Persian mythology as well, because Greek and Persian mythology, they often intertwine. We don't necessarily always acknowledge that, but they do often quite intertwine. So it probably comes from that. It might even be a Proto-Indo-European belief. But either way, we have this belief that you have a soulmate, you have another half to your soul. And it kind of speaks to this topic of two is the fundamental unit of humans, right? So you need two. I don't care if it's a guy and a guy, a guy and a girl and a girl, whatever the fuck, it actually doesn't matter. It just seems that two is the unit, right? And then our next one on this motivational hierarchy is esteem needs. Like self-esteem, we might call it. And we'll touch on that a little bit later on as well. And then after that, we kind of move into growth needs, right? All those ones we've talked about are deficiency needs, right? Like you need to have these or you will feel deficient, right? After that, we move into the growth needs, which are stuff that we need to actually do to actually, push forward in society, push forward as a society, become the best human that we can possibly become, right? And there's a quote, I actually don't know where I read it before, but it's kind of like when we're talking about self-actualization, which is the top of the pyramid, there is a quote, and I've said it to you before, Gary, where it's like, hell is to meet the person you could have been at death and to realize you are not even in his shadow, right? Like there's clearly a best version of you, right, that you could become. And you kind of want to be working towards that. Like you don't want to, again, meet this person on your deathbed and realize that you are literally a minuscule percentage of that person. Like you did not reach your potential, right? And this is why we focus a lot on getting the deficiency needs ticked off, because if we don't get those ticked off, you're never going to be able to actually transcend. You're never going to be able to self-actualize, right? So anyway, getting into that a little bit deeper, we have cognitive needs. And again, cognitive, you kind of know what they're talking about there. Like, are you being mentally stimulated? Are you actually thinking beyond just the, like, I know basic maths and I know how to speak English? It's like, what's your brain built for? Have you maximized that? Are you challenging yourself? Are you expanding your scope of cognitive development, right? Aesthetic needs, and again, these are environmental, personal, the whole shebang, right? Humans like a certain look, right? There's no two ways about it, and we want to kind of aspire towards that. And then once we've done that, we get into this kind of self-actualization, which is becoming your best self. And then we get into this kind of transcendence, which is not just maximizing the individual, it's going beyond the individual, right? Like, what are you doing to advance humanity? What are you doing to advance, society as a whole? What are you doing to advance your community? What are you doing to advance your family? Like we can look at that transcendence from multiple levels, right? Before I move back to just talking about those physiological needs, do you have anything to say on that kind of hierarchy of needs, that model?
Yeah, just some kind of overarching notes. Like one would be that when it was initially introduced, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, people kind of interpreted it as, that you needed to finish one step before you moved on to the next. And to some degree, that is true in a sense that, like, if you're totally hypoxic, to use your example previously, clearly anything else is not going to be important, or you're not going to be able to move on to it. However, the reality is that for the most part, you just need to mostly satisfy the need below before moving on to the one above. Okay, it needs to be mostly satisfied, but it doesn't need to be 100%. An easy example of that would be, if you're in total starvation, there's war in your country and there's a famine and everything, clearly that's going to be your most pressing need. You're going to be doing everything you can to seek food, and nothing else is going to gain your attention. However, if you're in a mild calorie deficit, like a lot of our listeners, you're still technically at a deficiency of nutrition to some degree, but you're still able to maintain attention on higher order needs such as safety, love and belonging, etc. And what's interesting there is that you can even see that, like, as bodybuilders get deeper and deeper into their deficits and deeper into stages of starvation, you can see how they're willing to accept larger trade-offs in some of the higher order needs. For example, belonging and love. They might actually sacrifice their relationships a bit because food seeking and their current state of starvation is actually their biggest priority, both psychologically and physiologically.
And
So
trend doesn't generally help with the whole, like, integrating into society.
that's true. That's true as well. Yeah, they didn't mention hormonal needs. Maybe that's in physiological. But yeah, and the other thing that you see here is the fact that an insult to one of your needs generally it produces a realization, but not for so long. An easy example of this would be, when someone experiences a loss, for example, in their family. Someone falls ill, and suddenly they realize what really matters. Okay, but they've moved down towards the deficiency needs such as love and belonging. They realize the importance of that because there's been a dent in the armor there. But 3 months down the line, when the person is well again, they might stop calling to see that person as often. They're no longer occupying as many of their thoughts. And they're back to caring about the things that they previously used to, such as their personal career goals, maybe financial goals, etc. And that's normal. That's a normal part of human life, that if something is intact, you're not going to be attending to it as much. So that's kind of just really important to understand those two separate things. The first being that you don't have to have 100% at any given level to care about the next one. And then the second one, that you might at certain points in your life move down in terms of the needs that you're tending to, if there's some sort of insult or injury to that need, while being able to kind of forget about it to some degree again in the future when it's intact again.
100%. And this also brings us to a kind of thought process here where like these needs are kind of like baseline requirements, right? And as we said, there's kind of gradations within those, right? And again, I like the idea of a pyramid because it's a nice metaphor or analogy in terms of it actually allows you to think, okay, well, if I build a sturdier base, that means that the higher order things, or the things that are higher up on this kind of hierarchy, like they can actually be sturdier. They can actually be more fully actualized, I suppose you might say, right? And this is interesting to kind of think about because we don't need to build an extremely sturdy base to be able to build a very tall building, right? Like, yeah, the sturdier the base, the better, right? But if we're talking about the kind of health needs here that we're going to be moving on to in a second, you don't need to be 100% perfect. However, you have to be willing to understand that there is a little bit of a trade-off here as well, right? Like a lot of people, they're kind of aiming towards this self-actualization. They're trying to be the best they can be in their career, for example, or as a family person, or whatever it is that like self-actualization means for them, but they're not actually looking after themselves, right? Like they're not actually fulfilling their physiological needs. They're on this kind of, okay, I've just barely ticked the box with physiological needs. We have a, energetic requirement, we don't photosynthesize or whatever, right? So we have an energetic requirement, which means you have to eat food. And yeah, you can tick the box with eating food and go, yeah, I've eaten enough calories, but that doesn't mean that physiological needs box is 100% ticked, right? And a lot of people are trying to achieve self-actualization or this kind of transcendence, and they haven't had a good night's sleep in 2 years. They haven't had a good high quality meal in the last month, like they haven't drank enough water in the last couple of days, so while there is this kind of, okay, you don't need to 100% have this, physiological needs or whatever else ticked off, there are still gradations within that. And the sturdier you build your base, the better, to an extent, right? And do you have anything else to say on that, Gary, especially around like kind of that kind of congruency?
Yeah, and this is something that we actually kind of use in our everyday language a little bit, in the sense that there's what you basically want to achieve as you move towards self-actualization is that there's more and more of an overlap between who you actually are, or who you see yourself as, and your ideal self. Okay. And this would be referred to as congruence. Okay. So Carl Rogers used to talk about this. He's a book called On Being a Person, I believe, and he talks about congruence. Okay. So you could look at someone who's incongruent if they had an idea of themselves that they'd like to be, the person they would like to be, and they're basically not doing any of it, so they feel that being healthy, being fit, being strong, reading regularly, loving their neighbor, etc., that all these things were ideals that they'd like to be aiming at, but they weren't actually actualizing it, any of it.
Or they might even notice that, like, and we've talked about it before, they're like, oh, I view myself as someone who's clear-minded or, good and under pressure or whatever. And then when they aren't looking after some of these baseline needs, they're not that person, so it might not be a case that they're like, oh, I should be doing these things and I'm not doing these things. They might notice that this is the person that I see myself as, and then when I don't do these things, I'm actually not that person. And again, a classic example is like, nobody is their best self when they're hungry, they're really starving. Like, you're not putting forth your best effort into the world as a result.
100%. And that happens to me in my own life as well. Like during exam periods, for example, when I know I'm not able to tend to my nutrition, my training, my sleep, my recovery, etc. as well. While I'm satisfying, my, let's say, cognitive needs by studying lots, I'm actually missing out on some of my basic physiological needs. And it leads to this sense of incongruence because I'm not my ideal self at that point in time. So that's just, again, another example of how you can move towards incongruence. And I think the important thing that is really important is to actually have some idea of what that ideal self looks like. It doesn't have to be perfect. And this is a really important thing, because when looking at congruence, you're looking at a Venn diagram, two intersecting circles, your self, true self, or your self-image, your idea of yourself, and then your ideal self. So the person that you're really aiming at. They're the two circles. And you want to try to maximize the overlap between the two, but it's never going to be perfect. Okay. If it was perfect, you would effectively be God, because you would have attained everything. Okay. It's not going to be perfect, but you want to try to maximize the overlap between the two. And ultimately, your ideal should be high enough that it wouldn't permit overlap. Because the other thing is, you could have a fantastic ideal and have it 100% achieved. And like I said, yeah, you have just become God. Or you could have basically no ideal at all, and your ideal is basically whatever you are at the moment, and then you're aiming at nothing, and then you're not moving forward. So that's not great either. So what you want is that you have some ideal self that you feel would be worth aiming at, that if someone else was to achieve, you'd be like, wow, that's a person I really look up to. It could be someone that exists. It could be someone that doesn't exist. It could be an amalgamation of multiple different people in the way that they live. But it is really worth giving some thought to that, because it helps you to make decisions. It helps you to make health decisions, financial decisions, career decisions, etc. Because if there's something that would take you away from that ideal self, it might take you away from that sense of congruence, that pursuit of self-actualization, and it's probably not great. So start with a general idea, and then you can tweak it over time, while appreciating that you don't need to have 100% on everything. You don't need to know exactly what you want your salary to be, but you might want to be able to provide for your children, for example. Just have some idea.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to that first episode we did this year in terms of goal setting. Like, it sounds like, oh, so foundational, like, oh, it's just goal setting. But like, if you actually spend the time to sit down and think, who do you actually want to be? And as we talked about in that episode, I think it was, do it in the next 5 years. Yeah, what do you want to do in the next 5 years? But then also look at it from your deathbed and go, what did I do in my life? Was I actually the person that I wanted to be? So going back to that goal setting, really important. But also, this kind of stuff helps you understand like why certain societies organize themselves the way they are. For example, like a lot of religious societies will basically have God as this like almost infallible, omnipotent character, and they're willing to overlook certain things that are clearly dichotomous to that. For example, like, you can't, like in Christianity, you have the concept of free will. They're like, okay, free will is a thing, but then they also have an omnipotent God, right? And if you're omnipotent, that means you know everything, right? And if you know everything, that means you can't have free will, because God already knows what you're going to do before you do it, right? But they're willing to ignore that for the higher ideal that, oh, this is what godliness looks like. This is what, the perfect overlap of these Venn diagrams looks like, where, the ideal self is the self, right? And that's fine. But you also see it done in certain other countries. For example, in Britain, right here, like I live in London, we have a constitutional monarchy. Okay. And the reason they have that, well, yeah, there's a historical reason. It kind of allowed the separation of God and politics, right? Or this ideal and politics, because you don't have to look to your politician to be the ideal. You kind of take it for granted that your politician is going to have, human corruption to an extent. But you look to the Queen as the infallible, the ideal, the certain thing that's like, oh, they're as close to godliness or the ideal self as possible, right? And that's a really good concept, the separation of those two things in society, because then you actually have a much more orderly way to run politics versus, for example, America, where they deify their like political leaders and they want their political leader to represent this ideal self, and they're humans. Obviously they don't. Now, obviously the Queen is also a human, but some people think she's a lizard person, but we won't talk about those. She's a human, so she still falls to these human related issues, fallacies, whatever, but we're still able to kind of dissociate that and go, okay, this is the ideal that we're aiming towards. That's why, for example, Canada still have the monarch as that ideal, because again, it serves that function of, oh, this is a higher ideal.
Yes, sir.
Fantastic.
God save the Queen.
See, again, the Queen is supposedly God. She's God's representative on earth.
Yep.
Anyway, look, the reason we covered all of that stuff before we actually dig into this discussion is because you kind of need that framework to understand high yield health practices, right? Because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about health management. We're talking about what are the ideal like health practices that you can engage in that are really high yield, that actually allow you to get higher and higher on that kind of self-actualization and actually become this ideal self, right? And the way we do that is manifold, as we discussed on that kind of what is health, like what are we actually aiming towards. We're looking at that kind of fully integrated human, and we're looking at it from the perspective of we want to maximize the intensity of living to whatever extent we can, but also maximize the duration of living. Like we don't want to, I don't know, live like a hermit and go, oh, I can't go out anywhere in case like I get hit by a bus or, I get sick from a virus or a pathogen or whatever. You want to be able to be resilient, and you're able to do the things that you actually enjoy doing, but also you don't want to do stuff that's just pleasurable in the moment that then sets you up to die young, right? And obviously you want to be able to live vigorously into your old age. Like I don't think anybody listening to this is like, oh yeah, I cannot wait till I'm 65 and I need a walker, I need, I can't get out of a seat, I need someone to wipe my ass. I don't think anyone is in that position where they're like, that's what I want and I want it to happen as soon as possible. Most people are like, what, I would rather be a 65-year-old that is able to do all the things that they like to do. They're able to go enjoy activities, they're able to walk up a mountain, whatever it is, right? Like they want to be a resilient person for the vast majority of their life. So what are the health practices that we can engage in to facilitate that, right? Well, we're going to quickly go over the foundational stuff that most people are aware of. We talk about it all the time. We're not going to labor the point. We're not going to spend too much time talking about this stuff, because you can go back and listen to the fucking first 180 episodes of the podcast and you'll get a lot of this stuff repeated, right? First things first, the diet. It's a foundational health practice. It is pretty much one of the foundational health management tools that we have. There's a number of ways that we can, divide this up and think about it. The first things first with all of this, like we need to be eating a calorie appropriate diet, right? And I say calorie appropriate, and that's the term we often use because that's different for everyone. Some people are going to need to lose weight. Some people are going to need to gain weight. Some people are going to need to maintain weight. And I'm just using weight as a proxy because that tells us a few things in terms of where our calories are at. But ultimately, we want to be eating a calorie appropriate diet for our goals, for our health, etc. Right? And we can use again that proxy of weight, because weight also does potentially tell us a few things about the overall health of the organism. Now, it's not a fantastic metric, but it does give us a little bit of insight. So we want to eat a calorie appropriate diet that allows us to obtain or maintain a healthy weight, BMI, body fat level, waist circumference, whatever kind of anthropometry you want to use to say, okay, this is the general range that people seem to be healthy within, right? Do you have anything to say on calorie appropriateness, Gary?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, we've discussed this in many, primary episodes, but there's very clearly calorie appropriateness as an important factor at every stage of life, because very early on in life, it's very clear that, let's say if you're malnourished, if you're overnourished in the neonatal or infant period, that can have untoward effects later on in life. Similarly, if you're obese at any point as a child, it's generally going to lead to, again, untoward effects down the line. Very difficult to reverse obesity if you were obese as a child. Similarly, if you're malnourished as a child and you don't have enough nutrition, for example, during cognitive development, during the process of learning in school, etc., that can all compromise your future self. And then we've got the standard things that we always discuss: obesity, obesity-related complications, diabetes, metabolic disease, etc., that are the big concerns for most of us as adults. But later in life, you do also run into frailty, sarcopenia, etc., as being very significant concerns. So that's also something that needs to be considered within the calorie appropriate framework. Calories that are too low later in life, malnourishment, is generally something that is not protective of health. So your ideal really is to maintain a BMI that is roughly within the normal range. Some people will be in the overweight category while still healthy because they have higher levels of muscle mass, maybe they have better body fat distribution, etc. But for the most part, calorie appropriateness is going to correlate with weight or weight trajectory over time. So if you're someone who has been, gaining body fat over a number of years and it's gone beyond the point of healthfulness at this point, obviously a calorie appropriate diet for you would be a deficit for at least a period of time, and vice versa if you're someone who's malnourished or very frail, weak, etc.
100%. And then on top of that, we want to have sufficient protein, sufficient fiber, sufficient essential fatty acids. And again, we've talked about this stuff before. Again, we won't labor the point. But then also we want to have a diet that, probably is having 10 to 15% or less of calories from saturated fat, because that seems to be protective, again, long term. And then obviously we want to have sufficient water intake and micronutrients, all that kind of stuff, right? Again, we're not going to labor the point on that. Most people listening to this, if you've listened to our previous episodes, you know our thoughts around what a good diet should look like, right? But ultimately, we also want to create a diet that is something that you actually enjoy doing and that you can actually integrate it into your life overall, and is something that you can see yourself doing for a long period of time, right? And obviously, there's going to be points in time where, you're eating in a calorie deficit, for example, and you're like, oh, I don't really see myself eating like this for the next 20 years. That's perfectly fine. I would argue that most people shouldn't be in a calorie deficit for the next 20 years, right? But you want to be setting up the kind of fundamentals or the foundation of your diet in a way that does actually lead to you enjoying and being able to stick to that diet long term, right? So is there anything else to add on the diet front, Gary?
No, that's good.
Yeah. So again, look, we're going through it quickly because we've covered it before, right? And effectively, the same kind of thing applies to training. Training is one of these foundational health habits. Again, we've talked about it ad nauseum. We're not going to go into a deep dive in terms of everything you should do, but ideally, we want to do some sort of resistance training. We want to do some sort of cardiovascular training. We probably also want to layer on some sort of low level, walking maybe, but some sort of non-exercise activity, because that does also contribute to calorie burn for one, but also it contributes to overall health. Because, for example, like lymph tissue, like we need that kind of contraction of muscles to have that kind of lymphatic drainage, and that's important for immune system function. Like we need the kind of squishing of cells to kind of have things moving through the body in that kind of interstitial space. Like we want to squish the water out, squish the water back in, all that kind of stuff. And stuff like low level walking does that. And while obviously cardiovascular training, resistance training does that as well, there's probably some benefit even from a blood glucose management from getting around and moving throughout the day, right? Do you have anything to say on that, Gary? And what are the kind of government guidelines or non-government organization guidelines for that?
Yeah, so it's the basics that we always come back to. You should be lifting, you should be doing some sort of cardio, and you should be general in your daily life, or generally active in your daily life. That is what you're looking for. If you're getting weight training somewhere between 2 to 3 days per week, hitting all major muscle groups, you're doing a fantastic job. If you're getting 150 to 300 minutes of moderate aerobic exercise per week, or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous aerobic exercise per week, again, you're doing a great job. If you can get your steps up on top of that and generally aim to make active choices like taking the stairs, parking a little further away, etc., all of those things are going to be more than enough for satisfying your needs when it comes to exercise. Now, some people may require different doses of exercise and special considerations at different points in life. For example, if you're dealing with children, you might need to prioritize fundamental movement skills as a priority when they're quite young, where they're learning how to throw a ball, catch, jump, run, etc., all the basics, before moving on to more complex physical training tasks later on. Similarly, if someone is very elderly, their dose of exercise might simply be transfers in and out of bed, transfers up and down off a chair, walking and modifying the environment in such a way that you're reducing risk of falls. All those types of things would come under that bracket of exercise or rehab, really, on that spectrum. So obviously there's individual considerations, but overall everyone should be doing, if they're concerned about health, some sort of lifting, some sort of cardio, and be generally active, and then you're doing a great job.
100%. And then on top of that, I do want to say it, because as soon as we say, oh, you have to do some lifting or you have to do some cardio, look, realistically, the best thing you can do is find some sort of activities that you enjoy doing, and you can see yourself doing them over a long period of time, right? And that's really important, because there's some activities that you might be like, I actually really enjoy this right now, but it's not something I'm going to be able to do when I'm 90. And if that's the case, for example, you're not going to see many 90-year-olds doing fucking boxing, for example, or Muay Thai, So it's like, okay, you might enjoy that now, but at least let's have an idea of what training looks like for you after that. Are you setting yourself up now so that you have some longevity in your sport of choice, but also some actual training modalities after exercise? Because this is something that we deal with a lot with our coaching. We'll have someone that, they used to play rugby, or they used to do fucking, I don't know, MMA or whatever, and now they're not able to do it anymore. They're older, or, they injured or whatever. Either way, they're not able to do it anymore. And now they don't have good fundamental health practices. They don't have good diet practices. They don't have a consistent training practice, because they never built those things while they were prioritizing their sport of choice, right? So while, we want to do stuff in the short term that we enjoy, we also want to set ourselves up for the long term, right? So just keep that in mind when you are thinking about this stuff, because look, cardiovascular training, you can pretty much do until the day you die, right? You might not be as good, but you can still do it, right? Resistance training, for the vast majority of people, you can probably still do that until the day you die. Again, probably not going to be your best performance when you're 95 years old. You're not going to be like, I just hit a new PB 340 kilo deadlift. You're probably not going to be doing that, but you can still be doing resistance training, right? Same with low level activities, right? Again, you might not be able to do the boxing that you enjoy or whatever. So keep that in mind. Find stuff you love, but also have an eye to the future. Do you have anything else to say on the training front, Gary?
Nope.
Fantastic. Again, the next fundamental health practice, sleep, right? And again, this is both of sufficient duration, but also of sufficient depth, or we could call it quality, right? Now, the issue with discussing sleep is that it's actually pretty hard to discuss the quality aspect. It's actually pretty hard to influence how high quality sleep you get. However, the vast majority of you listening to this have the ability to look after getting sufficient duration, right? Because the vast majority of people, they have an ability to decide what time they go to sleep, right? You might have less of an ability to decide what time you wake up at. You might have kids going to school, you might have work commitments, whatever. You're like, oh, I have to get up at 6 a.m. or whatever. but you generally have the ability to decide what time you go to sleep at, right? So that is probably the area that most people need to focus on. They need to get 8 hours of sleep as a general rule. We could say 7 to 9, but I think most people would need 8 hours of sleep to be able to get sufficient quality. And that means 8 hours of actual sleep, which probably means you need 30 minutes to an hour of wind down time before you actually go to sleep, right? Like, for example, I know for me, my sleep latency is 4 minutes, right? Like all the tracking stuff that I have would tell me that as soon as I like go to sleep, I'm like, oh, I'm going to sleep. It takes me 4 minutes to fall asleep. And my girlfriend will, unfortunately for her, attest to that. She's always like, you just fall asleep all the time so fast, you know? But look, I know that for me, you know? Whereas for you as an individual, it might take you more time to actually wind down. The reason I'm able to fall asleep, you know, within 4 minutes is because, you know, the last 30 minutes before I go to bed, I'm already thinking about sleep. I'm already kind of going, okay, you know, let's start, you know, relaxing a bit more. Let's actually start bringing the heart rate down, bringing the fucking gears in my head turning, like bringing that down, all that kind of stuff, right? So for me, I have those practices. I know where I fall in that, but I'm still looking to what time do I need to be asleep at if I need to wake up at this time in the morning, right? So that is something that people have the ability most times anyway. Like obviously, you know, there's going to be exceptions. And most people have the ability to look after that. But the other thing that we want to look at when we're talking about sleep is having some sort of consistent sleep schedule, right? It's not just good enough to be like, oh yeah, I get 8 hours of sleep. If those 8 hours are, you know, one time it's in the morning, the next time it's the middle of the day, the next time it's in the evening, and it's all over the place. We want to have some sort of regularity, some sort of consistency to that sleep schedule. Now, again, this is not going to be possible for a lot of people, especially if you do shift work, right? But this is again going back to this foundational health practice, and it's going to be something that we discuss later on as well in terms of like environmental screening. But if you're not able to get that consistent sleep schedule, are you okay with the trade-offs for that? Right? Like the WHO, the HWO, or the I can't even speak, WHO, the World Health Organization, they categorize inconsistent sleep schedule or lack of sleep as a carcinogen, right? Like it's likely to produce cancer, right? Now, are you getting paid enough to do a sleep schedule that potentially causes you cancer, right? You might not be actually okay with that now that you know that. You might be like, oh, Jesus, actually, I don't want to do shift work if it's going to give me cancer, right? Like, for example, again, a lot of people will be like, okay, I'm going to get you to do a job that has you handling, I don't know, uranium. You might get cancer from it, right? Would you be like, okay, yeah, I'll just do that for minimum wage? A lot of people would be unhappy doing that for minimum wage. So you have to, you know, calculate that in your job. And again, we'll talk about that in a moment as well, right? And as I said, look, you can survive a long time without food or exercise. Okay, like those two things, you can starve for a couple of weeks. You know, you can also just not move. You know, a lot of people do that. But if you don't sleep, look, you're talking like 3 to 5 days before things really get fucking out of whack, out of balance. You're probably going to have some sort of a psychotic or a psychosis going on. So look, you need your sleep. It's foundational. And again, you might be able to go, oh, I'm the individual that, you know, needs 5 hours of sleep. But is that reality? Or have you just always slept 5 hours and now you've recalibrated that like a sense of where you are on, you know, health or whatever as being lower? You're just like, okay, a 5 out of 10 for your actual body, for you, that feels like a 10 out of 10 because that's the best you've ever felt. You know, you're like, oh, this is it, you know, when in reality we get sleep sorted and all of a sudden you're like, oh, that was actually a 5 out of 10. I was in a bad position. I just didn't know it because you had recalibrated your sense of how you felt. So do you have anything to say on the sleep side of things, Gary?
The only final thing is to address sleep pathology if it's present, and that could be sleep specific. For example, you might have obstructive or central sleep apnea, where you have episodes of just not breathing during sleep, or very heavy snoring that's kind of along that spectrum. You can get that addressed. You can do sleep studies and you can get interventions for same, for example, a CPAP machine or something like that. So if that's something that you think you might be dealing with, particularly if you're very, very sleepy throughout the day despite getting enough hours, and people have constantly told you that your breathing sounds really labored when you're sleeping, or you're an awful snorer, etc., that could be something worth looking for.
Or
Additionally,
if
if
you
you
have something like a Apple Watch, for example, that
yeah
does some sort of sleep tracking, and all you're seeing on your sleep is like every 5 minutes or so, you're like, there's a disturbance, or every minute, disturbance, 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 and you're never seeing like those deeper sleep stages. Now, like both of us, I think we'd be in agreement that we don't think those watches and tracking stuff or whatever are like perfect or super high quality, but they still give you an idea of what's going on.
Yeah, and then the other part of that as well is if you've got a particular condition that is impacting your sleep. A lot of this is, mental health conditions, for example, if you have depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, other types of mental health conditions, many of them can produce, whether it be indirect, for example, anxiety that stops you from being able to wind down and get to sleep, or it might be that you have more pronounced narcolepsy, or just not able to sleep or whatever. Those types of things can also be addressed by addressing either the specifics or potentially those medications that you need. But again, address them if they're an issue, because you could be dealing with a lot more than just the depression or the anxiety. It could be that you're also dealing with all of the consequences of sleep deprivation that are potentially making the mental health condition worse, along with your physical health. So it can be a bit of a vicious cycle. So if you think there's anything that might be affecting your sleep beyond your sleep routine or basic sleep hygiene, do try to address that.
And that also goes to another point. Like you could be on a medication for a different thing, and that could be interfering with your sleep.
Yes.
And that is something that you should definitely bring up with your doctor. Don't just be like, oh, that's a side effect, because sleep is kind of, again, a foundational health habit. And I'm not necessarily going to say you could be making the issue worse by not sleeping, but that's something that you and your doctor need to discuss. If you're on a medication that's making you now sleep 3 hours per night, you're not getting that high quality sleep, you're not getting that recovery, whatever, like that might have implications for the disease that you're getting or the illness that you're getting a medication for. And your doctor might be able to, switch medications or, prescribe something else or whatever. But again, sufficient sleep of duration and good depth, that's what we're aiming for, right? Anything else to say on the sleep?
No, sir.
Fantastic. Next thing then is stress, right? And this is the end of the kind of four pillars that most people talk about, and it kind of really sets the stage for all the other stuff, which is actually relatively quick to go through once we get through these, right? Like you can't burn the candle at both ends. I think most people would be aware of this by now. Like you can't be high stressed and then expect to be in good health, right? Like they're generally dichotomous. Now, that's not always the case. You can have a really high stress individual that just has perfect health, right? But generally, overly stressed individuals don't live very long, or they end up with diseases that limit their ability to be productive. Maybe that's why they were stressed, right? So we want to have some sort of stress management tools in place. And again, we've talked about this before. We are actually probably going to do a series on stress management because there's a lot to discuss with this. And I don't think we've done a series on stress management before. But I also want to bring up the fact that there are some very basic tools for stress management. A lot of it, again, goes back to getting good sleep, exercising, good nutrition. And while, we can cover those things, there are still further things that we can do. Meditation is one thing that potentially could help with stress management. Now, again, I know everyone's a little bit hesitant to do meditation, although I think that is changing these days, at least around the discussions online. But also we can do some sort of mindfulness, right? And again, we're not going to get too deep in the weeds in terms of how to actually put that stuff in play, because we'll probably talk about that in future. But I do want to also say that stress management isn't just like breathing techniques and journaling and all of this kind of stuff that feels a little bit woo-woo or whatever, right? Like there is still more to it, right? Like for example, in training, we often talk about auto-regulation. How do you actually change the stressor you're about to put on your body based on the stressors that have already been put on your body, right? Or I suppose your recovery from those stressors. Like you have a poor night of sleep, oh, we're going to auto-regulate the training a little bit, we're going to dial down the intensity today or the volume or whatever, right? And to a large extent, you can also do that stuff in your life. Now, certain things are not going to lend themselves to that. Certain other things are going to lend themselves to that, right? But ultimately, we want to have some sort of auto-regulation practice in our stress management. We want to dial things up when we have the capacity to deal with it, and then try to dial things down when we're not able to deal with it, right? And a good way to kind of think about this is, do you have any hobbies, right? Do you have any hobbies that actually reduce your stress? Because the vast majority of people in this day and age don't have hobbies. Like, everyone likes to think they're unique and an individual or whatever, and then you ask them what they do and they go, oh, I do my job, do whatever, 9 to 5, 9 to 6, and then I go home and watch Netflix. I'm like, you're not a unique individual if you do the exact same thing that everyone else is doing, right? So we want to have some sort of hobbies, especially ones that really just, bring your stress level down. I don't care, is it painting, playing chess, reading books, whatever it is. Ideally, we want to have some sort of hobby that isn't a physical practice as well, because this is something that a lot of, health and fitness individuals will find themselves falling into the trap of, where they're like, oh, resistance training is my hobby, and it's like, okay, that's not really a hobby, right? Like, it's actually producing more stress on your body. And while we would say it's a nice hormetic stressor, it's helping you adapt to stress in the long term and it's making you more resilient, like, it's still not something that's completely therapeutic, right? So we want to have some sort of hobbies. And again, ideally hobbies outside of watching Netflix to 2 a.m. in the morning, right? Because that's not a hobby, first of all, and it's probably increasing your stress and it's probably reducing your sleep, right? Do you have anything to say on the stress topic, especially in terms of, thinking about this longer term when you're doing that kind of career planning and different things like that, Gary?
Yeah, I think this is something that should be kind of fitting into your longer term ideal that we discussed previously when we discussed congruence. And an example of that would be something like choosing a career based on whether or not it's permissive of other healthful practices or the general management of stress. So, for example, I'm a medical student. I'll have to choose a particular medical specialty or training pathway to go down. If I was to pick surgery, which is probably what I'm most interested in, huge trade-offs in lifestyle, huge trade-offs in the ability to be able to get to the gym, to have free time, to see your kids, your partner, husband, wife, etc. Not really the best if you're trying to maintain work-life balance, so to speak. However, if you were to pick a specialty like GP or dermatology or other fields, you might be able to have a much better lifestyle. You could be getting as much as 20 to 40 hours back in your week, which could be spent doing something productive or absolutely nothing. It could be your key to stress management, that it's just gardening, reading books, watching the football, whatever it happens to be. So long term, you need to be asking yourself those questions. And that's what I ask myself as well, because, when in younger years, I would have thought that, oh, I'll just work 100 hours a week forever. But then as you begin to mature a bit, you think, yeah, you know what, it would be great to not be stressed all the time. That might be nice. So that's something that might be within your value system. Now, with that said, you actually mightn't want to prioritize that. You might be an Elon Musk type character who just says, no, I actually want to work and dedicate my whole life to a single mission. And that's not necessarily related to family or personal life. It's solely related to business or career progression. And some people do that. The vast majority of people that do dedicate themselves to goals like that tend to be men. And you might be within that camp. But yeah, just choose wisely and do keep it in mind when you're planning for the future.
Now, I actually think, just based on the length of this episode and how long we've been going, I think we'll cover the psychosocial and spiritual stuff now, and then we'll actually come back in the next episode and we'll cover the rest of the stuff, just because I know, like, these podcasts can, they can end up being quite long and you're kind of like, okay, what were they talking about again? But anyway, we'll cover the psychosocial and spiritual stuff because I think this is really important, and then it kind of, again, will allow us to set the scene for the rest of the stuff we want to discuss, right? So when we're talking about this as a foundational health management practice, habit, tool, whatever, it kind of sounds a little bit woo-woo, right? Like, when you say psychosocial, like, what does that even mean? And then you say spiritual, people are like, I I don't want to be, you know, I grew up in a Christian country or whatever, but I wouldn't consider myself Christian, so I don't really have a spiritual practice, right? But what are your thoughts here, Gary, in terms of the psychosocial and spiritual stuff? Like, how does that fall into the realm of, you know, health management tool or health management habit, practice, whatever you want to call this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it can seem like it's not a very practical recommendation. And to be honest, we're not even making hard recommendations here because, some of it is very much personal. Obviously, the religious and the spiritual is very much a personal endeavor. And it might be something that's just not an option for you based on previous experiences or whatever. Or it might be something that you've been toying around with, or you might already be a very devout, faithful Catholic or Muslim or Hindu or whatever it happens to be. And the important thing here is that many people actually aren't aware that, like, I'll come back to broader psychosocial stuff, but really religiosity and spirituality are very much intrinsically linked with health. And what you often see is that when there's some sort of insult to, kind of like the needs that we were talking earlier, when there's some sort of insult to your health, religiosity seems to become more important, or it seems to maybe strengthen at that point in time. For example, when people are ill, when people are contemplating mortality, you tend to see them pray even though they might never have prayed before, or they might be asking deeper questions about what happens after life, etc. Similarly, when people have other shocks to the system, like people who have gone to war, for example, you see it in the US military post 2001, where a lot of people who would have went off to war and dealt with severe trauma, they had a higher probability of coming back and being more practicing religious individuals, praying privately and attending religious services. So there's kind of that back and forth there, where the religiosity and spirituality can be protective in the sense that you have lower rates of depression, lower rates of suicidality, especially in countries where you have a lot of religious diversity, which might sound a little bit kind of confusing at first, but when you think about it, if you have a lot of religious diversity, you're probably realistically living in a country, at least in the West, that is primarily secular and atheistic. So it means that you've kind of had to go through some battles to either maintain your faith or to make the conscious decision to practice your faith. So they're probably more faithful individuals than if someone is in a country that's already where you basically have enforced religion, then it might be a very much a top-down thing and not something that they've come to or preserved of their own accord. So you actually see that in countries like that with religious diversity, you end up with lower rates of depression, lower rates of suicidality in people who are religious or even just spiritual in some sense. So it does play an important role, but you can look broader beyond that and ask yourself, what might be some of the elements of religiosity, let's say, that are transferable to the atheist, or questions beyond religion. And you can see that clearly the community is a huge one, having a support network, community, someone that you can talk to, people that'll support you in your time of need, very important. An example of this would be if you look at the kind of contrast or similarities between confiding in a priest or confession or similar practices. A lot of that can be very similar in nature to the way in which a lot of people in the West would deal with their therapists. A lot of people have therapists and they'll deal with them in similar manners without the frills of religion. So there's elements of support and community that you can see within religiosity that also apply to broader life. You have to question your relationships with your family, with your friends. Do you have those support systems in play, both proactively in the sense that they're preserving your mental and physical health long term, but also reactively in the sense that if anything was to happen to you, you have that support network in place? So that's very much related to psychosocial considerations. Obviously, within psychosocial as well, you've got, living a life that is contributing to your psychological well-being and social well-being. That's very much related to things we've discussed already in the podcast, but also things we'll discuss after in the next episode, such as not doing drugs, for example. Do you feel connected to the people around you? Do you feel like they value you, you value them? Is there that kind of mutual benefit that you're getting from those relationships? And I suppose something that's a kind of a bigger question then, that is very difficult if you're not religious, is what's the purpose of life, and what are we here for? What are we aiming at? That can be really difficult, and you see that emerge a lot right now with questions of existential risk. For example, the climate emergency or climate crisis, which people will refer to. You can see that a lot of people have this kind of sense of impending doom, as if the world is going to end in the next 10 years because of the climate. And some people actually find almost a religious sense of meaning in that, and that they'll dedicate themselves to it. Or it might be that they feel that there's political threats to their sense of meaning and purpose in the world, and they'll dedicate themselves to that. So overall, we have a need for some sort of sense of meaning, some sense of purpose. Where you get that from is not something we can prescribe to you, but it's still something you need to be thinking about actively, particularly given the relationship between the psychosocial, the religious / spiritual, and then the more kind of hard things in the real world, like your community, family, friends, relationships, etc.
Yeah, like I always think the psychosocial and spiritual are intrinsically connected. It's basically just a continuation, because when we look at it, we can look at it from the individual perspective, and that's realistically what we're going to look at it through, because that's what we're here to talk about. We're talking about what you do as an individual, right? So when we're talking about that individual perspective, yeah, psychosocial, that's generally the term we're using to talk about this stuff. Like, what is your relationship, we'll say, with yourself? First of all, like, do you hold yourself in high self-esteem? Do you actually feel like you are someone that's worthy of love? Like that kind of stuff, right? We're talking about that, but then we're talking about, okay, what's your connection with others, like your immediate people around you, your family, your friends, your significant other, right? All of that kind of stuff, right? And then we're like, okay, what's your community like, the broader community that you're in? For example, the two of us do jiu-jitsu. I'm like, okay, I'm part of that jiu-jitsu community, right? Like, I'm part of a club, Gracie Baja, and Gracie Baja Oval in London, but I know I can go to hundreds of places around the world and go into a Gracie Baja club and be like, oh, I'm still connected to that community. And obviously you can do that in Brazilian jiu-jitsu in general. You can do it in a lot of sports in general, where you're like, okay, I do this sport, I'm now part of this community worldwide in my country, etc. Right? So you look at it in terms of the communities that you're in. Are you connected? Are you an integral part of those communities? Because we're using that as a proxy for you being a well-adjusted human. Right? Now, it's not always perfect. Like, you can be a really integral part of a community or your family or whatever, and still be dealing with, psychosocial or psychological issues. You could be, really depressed or whatever. But oftentimes, if you see yourself as a core component of, a family, of a community, and whatever, you end up having better outcomes from dealing with those diseases, right? Or those issues, right? But even beyond that community, like your broader impact on society as a whole, like, do you see yourself as having meaning, purpose, and a role to play in society, right? And then we go beyond that, and it's like, okay, well, your role in the world, right? Because the world is not just one homogenous society, it's multiple societies, right? We're not just a global, like, uni society, right? We have different societies there, different people's cultures and different things like that, right? And then we look at our place in the overall universe. You can be like, okay, just think of it from a purely scientific perspective in terms of the role of Earth in the galaxy and in the universe as a whole, right? And then you can look at it beyond that and be like, okay, well, what's the, like, where does that end? Like, is it just all just universe? Is it just that? Is there something beyond that? Is there a God? Is there multiple deities? Like, what's going on there, right? And you have to have some sort of connection that kind of goes through all of those, right? And again, you can just say you don't have a connection to God or a deity or whatever, but generally that's not the case, because even if you have a scientific view, like, I would be more in line with the religious views of, Spinoza, for example, right? And I would believe that there is something out there, and it's all the universe itself is some sort of godlike deity, like we're all interconnected. But you can just say, oh, I just have a scientific view of this stuff, and it's just a universe, we're just going to die, go back to atoms, see you later, right? And like, that might work for you, but generally, if you follow those people, you look at those people, they're very nihilistic. They have very poor view of the world. They don't act in the world like someone that is fully integrated, right? They generally don't have healthy family relationships. They don't have like a healthy relationship with themselves, right? So we want to avoid that. While you might have those views, you could look at that and go, these views are not productive to being a healthful human, right? So we want to look at it more so than just looking at the, oh, are you psychosocially connected? Are you psychosocially secure? Like, do you have good mental health? Do you have like a connection in the community with other people? Do you talk to other people? Or at least, as I said earlier on, like it seems to be that fundamental unit is two people. You need to have that back and forth. Like humans are social creatures. Like we can look at that in a very like scientific perspective, but I think that's not fully integrated into the world that we actually live in. But what are your thoughts there, Gary?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think that an excessive, I think that sometimes having an excessively material worldview, especially one that's quite arrogant in the sense that you can kind of explain everything and that everything is within your control and your powers of explanation, etc., is potentially detrimental to health. I think particularly mental health and in some cases physical health as well. I think that the kind of God of Spinoza perspective that you shared is one that I think a lot of more integrated people with a scientific worldview um, would hold, and I think that that is something that is quite a mature perspective that is somewhat protective against the nihilistic worldview. Some people end up falling into that hole of nihilism along with their scientific worldview, and that can get a little bit messy. It's hard to tell people what they should believe, and we're not going to do that. We have our individual beliefs, and yeah, but I think that ideally, if you can find a reason to live, some sort of meaning and purpose and connection with the individuals, the society, the societies, and the world and universe around you, I think that that's going to be a positive thing.
And as I said, like this is a bit of a woo-woo kind of thing because this is such a deep discussion, right? Neither you or I are psychologists, so we can't really dive deep on that, right? Neither you or I are, fucking, I don't know, thought leaders in religion, so we can't dive deep on that. But this is something that's clearly integral to being a healthy human, right? Both in terms of how you view yourself, how you look after yourself. For example, again, like you could look at something like what's it, the 7-day Adventists, in America, where they're like, oh, like they view their body as a temple. It's like my body is a temple, so they don't want to pollute it with different things that they view as being pollutants to that. For example, I don't think they drink coffee, right? Because they're like, oh, that's something that's bad for humans, right? And they have great health as a result of that. And that's obviously due to the religious practices that they engage in. But then we look at other religions or other communities or whatever, and they seem to have health protective things. Like, for example, you could join, I don't know, the Freemasons, for example. I know everyone knows, I was like, what the fuck is a Freemason? But the Freemasons, they literally just do charity work, right? Like that's basically the goal of the Freemasons. Now, the Freemasons also require you to believe in a God, right? So this is a little bit confounded. Like you're not allowed to become a Freemason unless you believe in a singular God. I think you can be polytheistic. I'm not actually sure, but you have to believe in a higher deity. So this is a bit confounded, but they seem to have better health, by focusing on, bettering their community, being a part of the community themselves, like they're Freemasons themselves, and then also, giving back to society through their charity work, right? So you don't have to join an organized religion to have these kind of psychosocial and spiritual benefits, these health benefits from having a psychosocial and spiritual, integration. Like you can get it elsewhere, we just want to avoid that kind of nihilistic, like who cares what I do, I shouldn't even look after myself, like fall into the depths of depression as a result of not having an integrated self. And maybe you can speak to this, Gary, because this is something you kind of dealt with, not necessarily this topic, but also just, the depression side of things, falling into that nihilistic worldview. But maybe you don't want to talk about it. And after that, wrap up the podcast.
Yeah, we can do it maybe in the next episode. Just because my house is getting loud, there's a dog, a mother, everything around. So, yes, This has been a productive episode. Hopefully you've learned a lot. We will cover a lot more in the next episode on some of the protective factors for your health long term, and finish off maybe some of this discussion about some of the psychological elements. Now, with that said, if you are looking for help with your fitness, of course, we do have coaching spaces available. You can work with us. You can work with myself, Paddy, Shane, Dean, Nicola, Brian. I almost forgot Brian. Sorry, Brian.
That's show up to the triage events, you know.
Yeah. So you can work with any member of our team. We all have coaching spaces available, full training and nutrition or nutrition only. And yeah, you can get in touch. The information is going to be in the description box below. Furthermore, just to note, Spotify do actually have ratings available now. So if you'd like to leave a rating on the podcast, do that there. If you listen elsewhere, that'd be fantastic too. We do also have a YouTube channel where we share snippets of the podcast, so subscribe and you won't have to listen to the full episode all of the time. We also have a newsletter or email list which you can subscribe to and get exclusive content. So do subscribe to that as well and join the Triage Method community, which is our Facebook group. And finally, if you're a coach, of course, we recommend that you join the Triage Method Coaches Corner to support your education. And if you don't want to join that, at least give us a follow on Instagram and keep up with everything that we're doing.
Fantastic. Anyway, I have nothing else to say. So enjoy, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your life if you don't ever listen again. Goodbye.